Welcome to MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things magic. In this video, we are going to discuss the quintessential cards needed to build the core of a Dragon Tribal Commander deck with the Dragon as its general. The Dragon made its debut as the front-facing commander option in the Draconic Domination pre-constructed deck from Magic's 2017 Commander product. This historical series of decks introduced the powerful Eminence mechanic to the game. The Dragon is a whopping 10/10 dragon avatar with flying for 4 and Wooburg mana. Its Eminence ability makes other dragon spells we cast one less to cast as long as the Dragon is in the command zone or on the battlefield. As most dragon spells are quite mana intensive, beginning the game with a cost reduction for one of the most powerful tribes in Magic is extremely beneficial, but perhaps not as powerful as our general's attack trigger. Whenever one or more dragons we control attack, we draw that many cards, and then we may put a permanent card from our hand onto the battlefield. The Dragon's mana value may seem like a barrier to being able to use its card drawing ability, but as we'll see later in this video, there are ways to dance around it. Our goal here is straightforward. We are going to sculpt the core of a dragon tribal build by filling it with Magic's most powerful dragons, while also supporting them with a suite of dragon-centric spells and effects. Earlier we alluded to the typical high casting cost of dragons. Well, we're going to begin the core of this build with some additional ways to reduce the cost of these spells. Dragon Lord's Servant, Nogi, Draco Zealot, and Herald's Horn reduce our dragon spells by 1. If Nogi attacks and we control at least 3 dragons, then it becomes a 5/5 dragon with flying until end of turn, while the Horn provides potential card advantage. Reducing our dragon spells even further are Dragon Speaker Shaman and Urza's Incubator. Each card reduces the cost of our dragons by 2. With any or all of these mana cost reducers on our side of the battlefield, we will be able to cast the Dragon much more easily and way ahead of curve. Speaking of way ahead of curve, Fist of Suns allows us to pay Wooburg mana rather than pay the mana cost of spells we cast, which is not a problem for us since we're playing a 5-color deck. Notice the text here. Fist of Suns does not specify that these spells must be cast from our hand. We could pay Wooburg mana and cast the Dragon from the command zone. It should be noted that if our general has any commander tax, we still must pay it even if we cast it through Fist of Suns. Manipulating the casting costs of our dragons is just one way to get them onto the battlefield ahead of curve. We can also cheat them into play by using Monster Manual, Belby's Portal, or Quicksilver Amulet. Monster Manual has an adventure side called Zoological Study. It mills the top 5 cards of our library and then returns a creature card milled this way to our hand. When cast as Monster Manual, we can pay 1 and a green mana, tap it, and put a creature card from our hand into play. When Belby's Portal enters the battlefield, we choose dragons. We pay 3, tap it, and put a dragon from our hand into play. Quicksilver Amulet is as straightforward as it gets. Pay 4 mana, tap it, and put a creature card from our hand onto the battlefield. As most dragons have converted mana costs north of 4, utilizing these cheat-into-play abilities allows us to get very powerful dragons into play and on the cheap. Speaking of on the cheap, Sneak Attack is even cheaper. We can pay a red mana and put a creature card from our hand onto the battlefield. It gains haste, and we must sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. As we will see later in this video, there are numerous spells and peripheral effects that allow us to benefit greatly through the use of this enchantment. We can consider Sneak Attack to be a win condition in this build. So how do we get the Dragon into our hand in order to use these cheat-into-play effects and get it onto the battlefield on the cheap? Well, we can tap and sacrifice Command Beacon and put our general into our hand from the command zone. Or we can pay 2, tap and exile Campfire, and put the Dragon into our hand from either the command zone or from the graveyard. We also can pay 2 green mana and cast Road of Return to put our general into our hand from the command zone. Perhaps we want a more repeatable effect for the purposes of getting the Dragon into our hand. Netherborn Altar provides this dynamic by simply tapping it, putting a soul counter on it, and then losing life equal to the number of soul counters on Netherborn Altar. This is EDH. We start with 40 life. If needed, then we should be able to activate this artifact's ability multiple times throughout the game, making it easier than Sunday morning to put the Dragon onto the battlefield with any of our aforementioned cheat-and-to-play effects. As an additional option, we could give our general a hasty one-turn appearance through Hellkite Coursers Enter the Battlefield trigger. When this 6/5 dragon comes into play, we may put a commander we own from the command zone onto the battlefield. It gains haste, and then is returned to the command zone at the beginning of the next end step. In this scenario, our general can come into play, attack, draw us a card for each attacking dragon we control, and then we put a permanent card from our hand onto the battlefield. It should be noted that in each aforementioned instance of putting the Dragon into our hand from the command zone does not accumulate commander tax, as we are not casting it from the command zone. We can cheat our dragons into play from our library with Kindred Summons. At instant speed, we reveal cards from the top of our library until we reveal a number of dragon creature cards equal to the number of dragons we control and put them onto the battlefield. This spell can be game-ending. We can cheat our dragons into play from our graveyard as well. Patriarch's Bidding can return every dragon creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield. However, this sorcery also allows our opponents the opportunity to choose a creature type and then return each creature of the chosen type from their graveyard to play. Great caution must be exercised when deciding to cast this spell. Let's remove the need for caution and create a one-sided Patriarch's Bidding effect by foretelling Haunting Voyage. These mass recursion spells are win conditions in this build. Since we're crafting the core of a dragon build, it makes sense to include some dragon-specific cards for the purposes of enhancing our tribe. Crucible of Fire is an enchantment that gives our dragons an obscene +3/+3 for just 3 and 1 red mana. Although our dragons are not hurting for additional boosts to their power and toughness, the rate of return on the mana invested into this spell is too high to ignore. Including a copy of Steely Resolve gives all dragons a Shroud, which is a powerful way to protect our creatures from spot removal and targeted disruption. Dragon Tempest is a win condition here. Whenever a creature with flying enters the battlefield under our control, it gains haste until end of turn. Whenever a dragon enters the battlefield under our control, it deals X damage to any target, where X is the number of dragons we control. Haste enablement is vital, as it allows us the opportunity to attack with our dragons the turn they come into play, rather than allowing our opponents opportunities to use sorcery speed removal before we can even send them into combat once. Speaking of sorcery speed removal, both Crux of Fate and Kindred Dominance can cleanse the battlefield of our opponent's non-dragon creatures. Orb of Dragonkind helps to fix our mana when casting dragon spells or activating abilities of our dragons. It also has a sacrifice ability that lets us look at the top 7 cards of our library to find a dragon, reveal it, and then put it into our hand. Dragon's Hoard also helps to fix our mana, as it can tap to add 1 mana of any color. As a dragon-specific bonus, whenever a dragon enters the battlefield under our control, we put a gold counter on this artifact. We can tap it, remove a gold counter from it, and draw a card. Mana fixing and card draw on a mana rock with a CMC of 3? Yes, please. Sargon's Triumph can put any dragon creature card from our library into our hand at instant speed. With a powerful suite of dragons from which to choose, this tutor could set up one of the many winged win conditions soon to be included in this build. For a little battlefield management, Spitflame deals 4 damage to target creature at instant speed for 2 and 1 red mana. Not the greatest direct damage spell for sure. However, Whenever a dragon enters the battlefield under our control, we can pay a red mana and return Spitflame from our graveyard to our hand. Through the dragon-specific synergy of this card, we can repeatedly remove our opponent's creatures. Although our general provides a card draw option through its attack trigger, it is important to infuse the core of this build with additional card draw effects for the purposes of keeping the heat on our opponents. Whenever a creature with power of at least 3 enters the battlefield under our control, Elemental Bond draws us a card. Kiora, Behemoth Beckoner, has a loyalty ability that untaps target permanent, which we can use to ramp out our dragons ahead of curve by untapping our lands or mana rocks. More importantly for this build, whenever a creature with power 4 or greater comes into play under our control, we draw a card. Temur Ascendancy does the same and gives our creatures haste, while Garruk's Uprising follows suit, but instead of haste it gives our creatures trample, and when it enters the battlefield, if we control a creature with power 4 or greater, then we draw a card. Kindred Discovery doesn't care about the power of our creatures, it only cares that our creatures are dragons. Whenever a creature of the chosen type, which of course will be dragons, comes into play under our control, we draw a card. Also, whenever a creature of the chosen type, which of course is still dragons, attacks, then we also draw a card. Notice the text secondary to this enchantment's attack trigger. We draw a card whenever a dragon attacks. This is not a one or more dragons trigger. Imagine the card drawing scenarios featuring Kindred Discovery, the Dragon, and a thunder of dragons on our side of the battlefield. Although not as reliable as our previous sources of card draw, we would be remiss without mentioning a couple of other card drawing artifacts. Vanquisher's Banner puts a card into our hand whenever we cast a dragon spell. Note, the numerous cheat into play spells and effects presented throughout this video will not trigger the banner's card draw ability. In these scenarios, we're not casting the dragon spells. Also, the banner's +1/+1 Anthem effect is not overly impactful due to the already high powers of our winged biggins. The Great Henge has a mana value of 7 and 2 green mana, but we will never, ever pay that much mana in order to cast this spell because its cost is reduced by X, where X is the greatest power among creatures we control. It's reasonable to believe that this artifact's true casting cost lies more closely to the aforementioned 3 CMC card draw options than its overall mana value of 9. We can tap the Great Henge to add 2 green mana and gain 2 life. And whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under our control, we put a +1/+1 counter on it and draw a card. Similar to the Anthem effect of the banner, the +1/+1 counters are not going to put us over the top. Additionally, the card draw trigger is limited to non-token creatures entering our side of the battlefield, a restriction not present in any of the other card draw options previously showcased. The game of Magic is at a point now where the power level bar for dragons has been raised very, very high. Since this build is 5 colors, we have hundreds of dragons from which to choose. How do we do so? Well, we are going to fill out the core of this deck with a diverse selection of dragons that synergize with the cards presented already, as well as establish alternate win conditions outside of combat. But of course, we'll start with combat first. We're not putting these dragons into play just to show them off. Atarka World Render gives dragons we control double strike whenever they attack, while Dragon Lord Kolagon gives them haste. When Scourge of the Throne attacks for the first time each turn, it gives us an additional attack phase if it's attacking the player with the most life or tied for the most life, while Hellkite Charger removes the limitations of these additional combat phases through its repeatable activated ability. Mana Acceleration will help maintain and enhance our tempo while simultaneously putting pressure on our opponents. Both Savage Ventmaw and Cloth Unrivaled Ancient have attack triggers that generate mana that we don't lose until end of turn. The Ventmaw gives us 3 red mana and 3 green mana, while Cloth gives us X mana in any combination of colors, where X is equal to the total power of attacking creatures. The mana generated by Cloth can only be used to cast spells. Clearly a tip of the cap nod to the potentially devastating synergy with aggravated assault. However, this restriction does not appear in the text box of Savage Ventmaw, and the mana generated by it can be used to activate this enchantment's ability over and over and over again. Continuing our mana acceleration trend is Ganax, Astral Hunter. Whenever it or another dragon enters the battlefield under our control, we create a treasure token. Goldspan Dragon creates treasure tokens whenever it attacks or is the target of a spell. It also lets us tap and sacrifice our treasures for 2 mana of any color instead of 1. When Ancient Copper Dragon deals combat damage to a player, we create treasure tokens equal to the result of our D20 roll. Old Gnawbone skips the die rolling effect by providing an ability that allows us to create a number of treasure tokens equal to the amount of combat damage dealt to our opponents by creatures we control. These treasure tokens are a great incentive for including a copy of Hellkite Tyrant. At the beginning of our upkeep, we win the game if we control at least 20 artifacts. If our treasure token production falls short, then Hellkite Tyrant's combat damage trigger of pilfering defending players' artifacts can make up the difference. Either way, Hellkite Tyrant provides an alternate win condition. Speaking of alternate win conditions, Scourge of Valkus and Terror of the Peaks have them in spades. The Scourge mimics the direct damage effect of Dragon Tempest, as whenever it or another dragon enters the battlefield under our control, it deals X damage to any target, where X is equal to the number of dragons we control. Terror of the Peaks doesn't care about the number of creatures we control, it only cares about their powers. Whenever a creature enters a battlefield under our control, it deals damage equal to that creature's power to any target. Imagine if we cast one of our aforementioned mass recursion spells and these dragons are in our graveyard. Mass recursion is not the only way to trigger these direct damage dealing dragons multiple times in a turn. We have a slew of ways to create dragon creature tokens with flying. Lothless Dragon Queen creates a 5/5 whenever another non-token dragon ETBs under our control. Whenever a dragon we control attacks, Utvara Hellkite creates a 6/6. Miram Sentinel Worm creates tokens that are copies of non-token dragons whenever they come into play under our control, except the tokens are not legendary if those dragons are. This is another potentially game-ending effect. Speaking of game ending, when paired with Dragon Tempest or Scourge of Valkus, an average roll of 10 from our D20 upon the activation of Ancient Gold Dragon's combat damage trigger should end the game on the spot. We create a number of 1/1 blue fairy dragon creature tokens with flying equal to the result. If we control Dragon Tempest in this scenario, then each token created by Ancient Gold Dragon deals 11 points of damage to any target when it enters the battlefield. This results in a total of 110 points of direct damage. Like we said, game ending. Let's wrap up this video by including some additional cards that will synergize with and enhance this build. Consistently getting dragons into play is our #1 goal. Bladewing the Risen does so by returning a dragon creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield whenever it comes into play. It also has a temporary dragon-specific power and toughness boosting ability as well. If we pay 2 and a black mana, then Teneb the Harvester recurs a creature card from any graveyard whenever it deals combat damage to a player. When Tiamat enters the battlefield, if we cast her, then we search our library for up to 5 dragon creature cards with different names, reveal them, and put them into our hand. With the various ways to manipulate the casting costs of our dragons, we should have plenty of mana remaining to put some of these freshly tutored for dragons into play. Sneak attack, anyone? Managing our opponent's armies can be accomplished with Silumgar Drifting Death and Balefire Dragon. They respectively can rid the battlefield of our opponent's creatures through -1/-1 until end of turn effects or through direct damage. As demonstrated earlier in this video, cards in our hand equals pressure on our opponents. Two-headed Hellkite draws us 2 cards whenever it attacks, and its double evasion of flying and menace ensures that it can survive the long game. If our D20 rolling is lucky, then Ancient Silver Dragon can draw us even more cards upon dealing combat damage to a player. Scale Lord Reckoner makes opponents think twice about targeting our dragons with spells or abilities. If they do, then we destroy target non-land permanents they control. Rith, Liberated Primeval, protects our dragons by giving them Ward 2, so any spells or abilities that our opponents control that target our dragons cost them an additional 2 mana to do so. As a bonus, its excess damage trigger creates a 4/4 red dragon creature token with flying at the beginning of our end step. Speaking of protecting our dragons, Dragon Lord Dramaka prevents opponents from casting spells during our turn, which is immensely powerful considering how many game-ending spells and effects we have showcased throughout this video. Rhythm of the Wild and Cavern of Souls protect our dragon spells from counter magic, and in the case of Rhythm of the Wild, it also gives non-token creatures we control Riot, which means that they enter the battlefield with haste or a +1/+1 counter. Lastly, Wrathful Red Dragon may make our opponents reconsider combat. Plus, it offers another potential win condition through a well-timed casting of Blasphemous Act. This video provided a blueprint for building the core of a Dragon Tribal Commander deck around the Dragon as its general. Removal spells, disruption, ramp, and the land base can vary from build to build, and also are dependent on metagame preferences and availability. The cards discussed during this video are suggested options for crafting the core of a Dragon Tribal EDH deck, in addition to providing ways to optimize this theme. Let me know your thoughts about these recommendations in the comments section below. This is MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things magic.